Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. You are often told to never discuss religion or politics, and given that we've spent the last 5 years talking about politics, we thought we may as well break the other rule and discuss religion this time. Tonight we are joined by Ben Phillips, who is a researcher in music, religion and culture at the University of Durham. Hello, Ben.
Hello.
And Hannah Rich, who is Director of Christians on the Left and Senior Researcher at the Theos think tank. Hello, Hannah.
Hiya.
To discuss the relationship between modern politics and Christianity, just in time for Christmas. So, hello both. Thank you very much for coming on. Much has been made about the link between religion and politics. We always used to see many politicians going straight from pulpit to dispatch box. Wales in particular has had a very interesting relationship between the two, with arguably the first evolved legislation being the law that prohibited the selling of alcohol on a Sunday, followed by the disestablishment of the Anglican Church in 1920 in Wales. Ben, I think your expertise is better on that particular subject, but can you explain in your own words what you think the connection is between faith and politics?
I think there's a huge overlap in terms of belief in a cause, belief in what is right. And, faith communities give that. Certainly, Christianity, we're talking about Wales, ground you in that. And the faith traditions of Wales certainly are good for grounding in that. So it does seem that there is a through road from faith to politics. And certainly, we could go through a number of high profile Welsh names, Chris Bryant, of course, being one of them, but the present First Minister's father, Canon Bob Morgan, of fond and glorious memory, being another. I think the belief in the political comes out of the faith. And I think it is an outpouring of that. I think they work hand in glove rather than being separated and being treated as separate.
Yeah, I think at a personal level, they fit together very easily, actually. For me, my faith and my political engagement have always felt kind of intuitive, that one would lead to the other, and vice versa. I think they are both and can both be really strong drivers for civic engagement, for engagement in public life, be that through volunteering or getting involved in formal politics. And I think that sense of having something stronger and bigger than yourself actually motivating everything that you do is true of people of faith, and it's true of those of us weirdos who belong to a political party as well. In many circumstances, we're the minority for both of those things, actually, to belong to something, be that a church, be that a political party. But I think that sense of belonging and that sense of commitment to an institution that is imperfect but bigger than yourself is a really strong driver for both of them. And I guess if you have that sense about one of them, then it is intuitive and it is natural that maybe you're more inclined to the other as well.
So, Hannah, Christians on the left often say that their socialism owes more to Methodism than it does to Marx, and that's something we say a lot in Wales as well, and especially in Welsh Labour. But what do you understand to be meant by that, and how true do you think it is of the modern left?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about that, not just about Christians on the left, actually. People talk about the whole Labour Party owing more to Methodism than Marxism. And I think that is both an ideological thing historically and a very practical thing, actually. There's, it's said that the way CLP meetings operate, the way local Labour Party meetings operate were modelled on local Methodist meetings, and party conferences modelled on synod. And we're all, those of us that are familiar with either of those kind of things, of cold church halls, stacking the chairs yourself, it looks like church and it looks like a CLP meeting. And I think that when we say Methodism and Marxism, actually is that history in being rooted in local community, being rooted in a really small level democracy or a small level involvement that scales up to something bigger. So I think there is that ideology right throughout the history of the Labour Party, that idea of people of faith, Christians in particular, influencing it. But actually in that practical, structural way that we organise, way that we are motivated to do stuff, to get to know people locally, and to do stuff together. I think that's really important, actually, as well, in the way that the church, the history of Methodism or Christianity has influenced the Labour Party at large.
Ben, I saw you nodding away there. You got any thoughts on that?
I agree with all of that. In preparing for this, I've been doing some deep dives, and certainly modern Wales has been shaped politically by nonconformity and socialism. And that's, I'm stating a bare fact that everyone knows that. But it is interesting what Hannah was saying about the similarities. That actually, a CLP meeting often is very similar to a church hall meeting or a parish council meeting or a vestry. And I think that is absolutely right. It is about community. It's about the local. Yeah, okay, we can, in England, we have the big General Synod for the Church of England. In Wales, it's the governing body of the Church in Wales that meets. But, every diocese has a diocesan conference. Every parish has a PCC that meets in drafty church halls or schools. And like, CLP or the Tories or the Lib Dems or Plaid or Reform, they gather in these places, in their communities, and are thinking of what best to do and to articulate that as they believe it. And I think again, it's that intermix of faith, belief, right, social action that does make faith and politics walk hand in hand. And it's almost inescapable. I find the whole Alistair Campbell alleged quip, "we don't do God," quite difficult actually, because especially if we're talking about Welsh politics, well, if you don't do God, how did you get into politics in the first place? Where does that political inheritance come from?
Ben, you talked a little bit about what I'm going to ask you next in your previous answer, but we'll build on it a little. So the Church in Wales in particular played a big part in the era of creation of Welsh devolution. Other figures such as Rowan Williams have said they think that Wales should be a bit more politically autonomous. What do you think about the relationship between modern Christianity and Welsh nationhood especially given that some Christian denominations have bits of their Welsh administration still part of their English administration. As I said before we recorded, my archdiocese is Cardiff and Menevio, which goes into England, so it's not a Wales only specific diocese.
The Church in Wales, in a way, has a very different journey along this than I'm being lazy in saying nonconformist, because we group them all together. They weren't all grouped together. There were many different denominations, some hyperlocal, some more federated, if you think of the Presbyterian Church in Wales, for instance. But the Church in Wales's route was a journey from being seen as certainly in the eyes of the Lloyd Georgian liberals, as being the English in Wales, to, well, within the first 50 years, leading the fight for devolution and further democratic decision making to Welsh bodies. So a Welsh church for a Welsh people. It was interesting you mentioned Rowan there. His predecessor, about 3, maybe 4, William Williams, who was also Bishop of Bangor, really was kind of a big proponent of devolution. He contributed to the paper the British Council of Churches put together, talking about English, Scottish, and Welsh devolution. And it's clear, but by 1977, when it was published, there was no doubt the Church in Wales was pro further powers coming to Wales.
And what would you have to say about sort of church involvement in wider civil and civic society? Do you think that that's still prominent now, or is it less than it has been in the past?
I think it's still important. Whether that is the same as prominent, I don't know. I think it's still very valuable. So I would definitely, I'm sure we'll get onto this, but I would definitely defend, for example, it's a difficult week to be doing that, but I'll defend the right of bishops to be in the Lords, because I think actually what they bring to that is some of this local representation. Actually, it always strikes me that when the Anglican bishops stand up and talk about child poverty or migration, they're not doing it from nothing. They're doing it from the experience of thousands of parishes in their diocese or in their locality who are at the coalface of that. So they have spoken to churches that are running food banks or church congregations that have large number of asylum seekers, for example. And it's that expertise that comes from the local. It isn't just spiritual, I guess, to go back to what I was saying before, it's intensely practical as well. And I think there is a voice that the church can have into politics, into public life, that is grounded in the very local, at the parish level actually, that then is aggregated up to the reason that the church can be or should be taken seriously. That's not to say we always get it right. This week of all weeks, we're very aware of that, right, in Westminster, and the relationship that we have between the Church of England and bishops there. and the state. There's an amendment, I believe, going through the Lords at the moment that would, for example, Harriet Harman's put it down, I think, to do away with the bishops to the Lords altogether. And I can see where that comes from if you're not a person of faith, that it feels a little bit unfair, that by virtue of being ordained and being picked to be a bishop, they have a position there. But I actually would defend their right to be there as representatives of something much bigger than just the church as a spiritual institution, that the expertise that they bring is incredibly valuable, beyond just the theological, as it were.
Well, I agree with everything that Hannah's just said. And I think that is one of the great sadnesses. And it was an intended consequence. But the pulling of the 4 Welsh bishops out of the House of Lords as part of disestablishment did lose for Wales, for a considerable period, nearer the ground. I won't say on the ground, because remember, it's a century ago, bishops were different then. Nearer the ground representation of the people of Wales. It'd be great to go back and have a look and see how many Welsh peers there were in 1920 or 1940 when the Act went through, and how many there are now. But for a considerable period, until probably the Life Peerages Act 1958 went through, how many Welsh peers would have been in the upper house? And I think that is a sadness, in a way, that for quite a period, say nearly 30 years, well, there was very little Welsh voice in the upper house. It all got picked up in the lower chamber in the House of Commons. And, that's where people should be represented, of course. But it's an intended consequence, but an unintended sadness that Welsh voices were snuffed out by Lloyd George liberalism in attempting to bring through disestablishment.
So we do see an awful lot of prominent Christian politicians. I mean, the 3 of the 4 leaders in the Senedd are practicing Christians. Do you, though, think that we're seeing fewer prominent politicians who are Christian or who are open to talking about their faith, Hannah?
You'll have heard me say, Matt, that 1 in 9 Labour MPs after the latest election is a Christians on the Left member, and 1 in 8 has a Christian faith. There are a few that I've yet to nail down for their direct debits there. But 1 in 9 is, I think, punching above our weight, actually. And within that, you have the whole breadth of the church in the UK. There are very many different denominations represented there. There are people who are very public about it and people for whom it is a intensely private thing, just as there are in the population, right? Some people who are more comfortable talking about their faith and some for who it is their primary driver, but maybe something they're more comfortable keeping a little bit more private. And that is true of our MPs as well. And that is right, I think, and right and good that they're able to live their faith out authentically. That doesn't have to mean they mention it in every speech. There are some, if I was to list our members of that, I won't do it, but there are some you could predict, and there are some you'd probably be quite surprised to learn are Christians on the Left members. And I'm quite happy for it to be that way, actually. I think it's a mistake to think that there are fewer Christians just because there are fewer mentions to it in speeches, or fewer if you go through Hansard. Maybe Jesus isn't mentioned every day, but that doesn't in any way mean that faith is less prominent, that Christianity is less prominent there. And I think certainly maybe where it's different or differently articulated is that if you were to ask many of them why they are in politics, their faith would be the first thing they would go to. It might not be the first thing they talk about in every aspect, and it might not be evident in all of the policy areas that they choose to focus on, or that they feel kind of involved in. Jonathan Reynolds, for example, the business secretary, will tell you very powerfully that he is a Christian who's in politics because of that. Business secretary isn't necessarily the obvious place for that to be outworked, but he would be able to tell you how that is outworked, but particularly in his journey of faith through politics. And that's true for so many more of them, that it's the reason they're there, even if it's not something that they shout from rooftops every single day.
Ben, we have seen instances where prominent Christian politicians, people such as Tim Farron or Kate Forbes, there's been a sort of hyper fixation on their Christianity. What's your thought on this, and why do you think it's happening? Do you think this is particularly a problem for Christian politicians who are traditionally on the left of the political spectrum?
I'm very happy for Hannah to jump in on this with me, given her experience. But I think being a Christian in public life is hard these days because in so many ways it is so divorced from what is seen in the media and in wider culture as normal. Go back 60 years, of course, everyone went to church and a place of worship on a Sunday. That kind of era has gone. Whether belief has changed, or most of those people going 60 years ago did believe, that's another matter. But I think it is hard, and especially if you're not part of a denomination which is, dare I say, cozy or softening to current trends. I think if you have a kind of very Bible-based, what some would describe conservative views, I think it is going to make you be a beacon for people who disagree with you, even within your own party. So I've got sympathy for both Tim and Kate's predicaments. They're both in parties which are, Tim's a liberal, but Kate, SNP is a left party, much more left party. I could see that there is going to be a fissure there between what the party platform is going to say and what their faith sometimes requires of them personally. It would be quite boring if all politicians were pulled from an identical pool. But I think it does add colour. I think it does show that people stand for something, even if you disagree with them. I know discourse has got so vitriolic of late, but I think, the idea of good disagreement and respecting someone for having a viewpoint, even if you do disagree, needs to be recaptured. But I think recent things like assisted dying, if you had a Roman Catholic MP, of course, it was fairly obvious which way they would vote. For smaller Protestant churches, it is very much between you and God and you being judged. I think that is quite harder, and you do feel much more alone because you have your faith, you have your party, you have your whip, and you have your constituents, and you may have to just go with your gut and hope that you're not upsetting the wrong or right people. And I think that must be very, very soul-searching and require a lot of deep thought and a lot of deep prayer.
Hannah, we're going to get into the assisted dying debate a bit later, but I'm intrigued in your thoughts on the original question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to our lack of ability to kind of hold nuance in general. We're just really bad at that in public life, in society at the moment, at a time when actually, we'll get onto this in assisted dying, we need it more than ever, right? We need to be able to hold complicated and nuanced things together, and we're just not very good at that, and the media are generally really bad at that. And I think that's part of the reason that when someone like Tim Farron or Kate Forbes comes up, you can't be put into a box because they lean one way on something else, but they're maybe more socially conservative on other issues. The media doesn't really know what to do with that. Whereas actually, if you're someone who is in church, you're really used to that. You're used to the fact that there are a lot of people who are more socially conservative than the average person, but might lean left economically. There's certainly within our membership and within the running of Christians on the left, there is a wide variety of theological views, and some who are far more socially conservative than others, but feel comfortable belonging on the left and in Labour. And we're really used to that as Christians, and I think we are able to hold that together in a way that perhaps has something to teach the media, and perhaps there's something to teach wider society. But certainly, if you have an understanding of faith, even if you are more liberal, you are used to the fact that there are a large chunk of the population who are more socially conservative. I think sometimes politicians who are liberal or on the left fall into that trap of thinking everyone thinks like them, and those who are more socially conservative on any given issue are just a fringe number. And actually, like it or not, electorally and in terms of the proportion of the population, they're not. Anyone who belongs to one of the major faiths will know that. And I think that, that ability or inability, as I said, to hold nuance and to understand that someone might have a position that you like on one thing, but a position that you don't like so much on another for whatever reason, that is fine, and that can be held together. Maybe we just need to get better at that.
It's interesting that the Alistair Campbell line that we don't do God was brought up, because my next question is about Tony Blair, who's someone who didn't reveal his faith until he left office. What does that say to you about what we just talked about, the way that openly religious politicians are perceived?
I think I'm actually on that one reluctant to read too much into that, other than about Tony Blair's faith and his relationship to that, and it's his prerogative to share it or to not share it. We can't do one of these talks or one of these podcasts without the Alistair Campbell line getting brought up. On my kind of bingo card of things people will ask about Tim Farron and Alistair Campbell, actually, if I do any talks about religion and politics and how they fit together. But I don't think actually it is characteristic of how we understand them more generally. It's certainly not characteristic of the current Labour Party not doing what or not wanting to, if you break it down as the individuals that are in that party. And so, yeah, I think it's, it maybe says more about where Tony Blair was at on his journey of faith. He was thinking about things and thinking about what he believed at that time, and that is maybe something that didn't have to be done on the world stage.
So, as you said, it's more the personal rather than the political.
Yeah. I think in that particular case for him, certainly.
Yeah. Ben, did you have anything on that?
Well, I do. Hannah's right. I think from what I've read of Tony Blair, Tony was on a journey of faith that led him to Roman Catholicism. His, wife Cherie, a devout Catholic, and they raising their children as Catholic. I think it makes sense that he was drawn to it. Of course, whilst he was Prime Minister, there were difficulties for him to, dare I say, out himself as Roman Catholic due to constitutional position. Of course, we saw a little bit around this when former Prime Minister Boris Johnson got married during COVID, that actually there are some appointment prohibitions related if a Prime Minister is a practicing Roman Catholic. I could see why a trained lawyer such as Blair might go, I identify as CFE, this will be easier for now, and when I leave office, I can be of the faith I wish to be. For purely political and pragmatic reasons, that you're not having to go, well, I'm sending all the church appointments, which of course, at that point, pre the 2007 Gordon Brown reforms, were substantial. Everything senior was flowing through the Prime Minister's office, and they were taking a good old look. Whereas if that had not been the case, it would have needed to be dealt with by another senior officer, most likely the Lord Chancellor. So I'm hoping maybe the papers will prove me right one day, that actually Blair thought about this. This wasn't just, only a personal journey of faith. It was sort of shaped by the present constitutional settlement. Whether people are for or against that, I don't know. I think it is something that is worth looking at going forward, seeing as we have had prime ministers who are being Hindu and agnostic and dare I say, afraid to say atheist. Why people who believe in the Lord Jesus Christ but worship in another church cannot be formally part of an appointments process seems to be the last legacy of intolerance that we managed to ditch during the Catholic emancipation. So, but that's a personal view. But it would be really interesting to see and work out whether any of Mr. Blair's reasons for converting post-premiership were down to constitutional issues.
Well, speaking as someone who converted to Catholicism slightly later in life, I got no issue with doing it whenever you choose. So we've talked a little bit about this, but I think it's something that is worth exploring more. I was always taught that Christianity doesn't really neatly fit into either left or right of the political spectrum, but there does seem to be a focus on the more conservative aspects of the religion, especially in places like the United States at the moment, rather than the very progressive aspects of the faith, particularly in relation to social justice. Huge steps forward in society, such as the abolition of slavery, were driven by Christian movements. Hannah, why do you think this is?
I think when we look at America and the way Christianity interacts with politics over there, it is more explosive, it's more right-wing, and it is in a way more interesting, I guess, looking at it from afar. It kind of plays into everything that we think about American politics as this kind of drama that we like watching from afar. When we kind of don't like the election of President Trump, it's easy to blame that on the church, particularly for media that are not that sympathetic to religion or not that understanding of it. It's very easy to say, oh, the evangelicals voted for Trump. isn't that crazy. That's such a strange understanding of it. And I think it's a risk if we try and import that here. Both, it's obviously a risk if that actual form of Christianity was imported here, but I think there's a risk that we import that understanding of it actually in a way that doesn't fit with the British Church at the moment, or with British politics at the moment. That's not to say that on the left we have the monopoly on Christianity in the UK. We definitely don't. But I think it's a mistake to kind of look at America and think that's where we're heading, or to think that is what it means to be a Christian. And maybe it is because it is louder there. We've talked about whether it's prominent, whether it's important, where the politicians of all faiths have to talk about it in the UK. In America, they're very free to talk about it, and they talk about it very openly, and it's very loud. And it's loud in a way that it isn't necessarily over here. So maybe we hear that more. I'm quite comfortable with it being a quieter thing on both sides of the house, influencing things, but not in a divisively shouty kind of way. But I guess maybe it's inevitable that is not quite fun, but it's quite hard to tear your eyes away from.
I just want to kind of pick up a point that Hannah said about it being loud. Hannah, do you think it's louder because there's a sort of constitutional taboo about it? Like here we have the Church of England. Well, I'm sat in England at the moment, and in England you have the established church, and that is run in seam with government and sits in the House of Lords. And, as we saw in the papers today, it still has an established role in life. But because the United States and each of the individual states is constitutionally prohibited from having that, do you think that aids it somehow? That not being able, that it's almost a bit naughty to kind of go in saying, we do Jesus, we do God, we're going to reinforce this. Do you think it's sort of jumping around because they have to, because they know there's a fissure there between their constitution and wider society on religion?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it's not necessarily one that I've thought of before. But I think actually it might not be constitutionally allowed or kind of enshrined in America, but culturally it is much stronger than it is here. So there's a cultural expectation on politicians. There's definitely not a constitutional one. We talked about how here perhaps the constitution is stronger than culture when it comes to faith. I think the reverse is true in America, that it is very, for large swathes of America anyway, culturally expected, not only accepted, that politicians will have a faith and will talk about it a lot. And actually that sort of spreads wider than just their ideology. It spreads into how they talk about their families, how their families are all kind of part of their campaign in a way that they don't have to be over here. And I think that is very healthy. But there's that whole kind of cultural creation of American Christian culture, American evangelical culture, I might say, that doesn't actually have a whole lot to do with faith, but it's a cultural value that is there and that is very hard to get rid of, ironically harder to get rid of than a constitutional kind of expectation there, because we can kind of disregard that a little bit, or it can be, it can still be there in the constitution, but less culturally important to people. Actually, it is so ingrained in American culture that I think that is almost harder to unpick.
So one of the major political discussions at the moment is the assisted dying legislation. A lot of politicians have brought their faith into their reasoning for voting against the legislation, but there's also a number of MPs with a strong faith who have backed the legislation. Hannah, how do you think this discussion has developed through the course of the legislative process?
I think it's been really interesting to see it break down some of those assumptions that all people on the left go one way or all people of faith go another. And actually that sense of what it means to be socially conservative, there might have been an assumption going into it. I think there certainly was on the Labour side that all Labour MPs are more progressive, they're on the left, this is going to pass very easily because that's what it means to be left and progressive. We've actually seen some of the strongest socialist MPs, who you might say are the furthest left, have really strong ideological and political reasons for opposing it that are nothing to do with faith. And people in different camps, people who wouldn't be in the same camp politically on anything else. There's very few other issues I can think of where Diane Abbott and Danny Kruger would come out on the same side of things, both with really strong personal reasons for opposing and being happy to be on the same side as something. And I think that has been a surprise to a lot of people. I think there's an assumption that if you are progressive, you are on the left, you'll think this. And the reason that it failed or didn't pass a few years ago was because we had a Conservative majority then, we have a Labour majority now, ergo it's going to pass easily, and that's just not been the case. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about earlier about needing the nuance to be in there. Actually, if you understand the debate, it is so complex, and there are such a plethora of reasons for supporting and a plethora of reasons for opposing, some of which have to do with faith, some of which have nothing to do with faith. You can make a very strong, I would argue, left-wing case against it, completely secularly, or from a completely secular perspective. And so for us as Christians on the left, that's been something we've been acutely aware of through the conversation, that we are Christians and we're on the left, and it's because of both of those things that we have taken the line to oppose it, not just because we're Christians, therefore we have to. Actually, even if you took my faith out of it, I think the political side of me can see the case against as well. But I think that sense in which it's really complicated isn't something we're necessarily used to seeing apply across the House, and it's been really interesting to see how that's played out.
I think it's really interesting to see how the faith communities in Wales made their case against assisted dying, showing that even when there are differences of denomination or even between interfaith, they could join together through mutual values and mutual shared ideas to come and put together a statement. You know, I recall that the bishops the Roman Catholic bishops, the Anglican bishops, the representatives of the Evangelical Alliance joined with the Sikhs, the Muslims, and the Jewish groups to come out in Wales against this. Like Hannah said, I've seen online many, many faithful Christians come out and be absolutely pro this. It is such a difficult topic, but trying to get Christians to speak with one voice is often quite difficult. It's even more so in an interfaith arena, but it is clear that on certain subjects, this being one of them, a realism had to come, and they had to join together in articulating that. They took note of MPs and the progress of the bill, and we'll see what happens next. But, you know, I can't see faith leaders stopping a campaign just because it's gone through. They're going to keep going and look at how this is going to be implemented and how this will affect those in society who often have no one else to turn to except their local faith representatives.
Yeah, I think the interplay between faith and politics on this one is something I found really interesting, because actually, in a way, against some of my usual instincts, I found myself wanting to amplify not the faith voices in this conversation, because I think we as people of faith understand how complex it is and quite what a statement it is for several churches to get together and say something. But for someone who is on the outside of faith looking in, that is maybe just what they expect.
Absolutely.
And so I have found myself going back and forth with strategically, is it the right thing to do or not? It's always the right thing to do, but is it the most strategic thing to do if, as I do, I don't want this bill to pass? Actually, should we give the microphone to the unusual suspects on this conversation, or disability rights groups who are speaking out very powerfully on it? But at the same time, it is incredible to see how the communities have come together, and I want to celebrate that. But I also I'm not sure if that is what is going to win the argument more widely. And so I found myself kind of going back and forth on all these complexities, whereas normally I would be very uncomplicatedly, it's brilliant that the churches are saying something on something politically that I agree with. I found that being a slightly more complicated thing to figure out strategically than I might normally have done.
Well, I think it shows, marginalised is not the word I really want to use, but how faith has lessened in the public imagination. You know, if you go back, and I know we're touching on this later, the Welsh dry laws and the referenda in 61 and 68, you know, it's really, really clear that faith communities, particularly nonconformist faith communities, were able to count very heavily on their faithful to go out and vote no and vote to keep Sunday closing. But I am struck by what you said, that, Hannah, because it is almost like now faith communities have to live in a reality where they don't have a domination to the majority of the population, which they have to fight alongside allied groups, in this case, of course, disability groups. And I think that does change how faith leaders, faith communities make their argument. You know, the missive from the Welsh bishops and similar from the Catholic bishops, at one time that would have been enough. Now it's, well, we put our own thing out, we sign the letter with the other faith communities. It has to be much more clever, and it's sort of acknowledging the weakened position of faith and particularly Christianity in British society and Welsh society.
I mean, it's very interesting, this discussion, isn't it? Because my parish church, although it is everything is small p political, of course, in the church, we are quite a small p political church. We have regular discussions about sending letters to prisoners of political conscience, but this issue has come up more and more at the end of Mass than any issue I think I can ever remember. But it is intriguing to see where the other prominent yes or no voices are coming from in the absence of that church setting.
Matt, can I ask you a quick question on that?
Yeah, of course.
So a little bit ahead of the vote in Westminster, there was a vote on this in the Senate. How do you think faith played into that? Because that didn't pass, and I was really pleased to see that. It was quite a convincing result, which I think did give some heart to the Westminster campaign. But do you think that was, do you think faith played a role in that in a different way?
It was certainly discussed during the debate, Hannah. A number of people who voted against stipulated that it was because of their faith. If you look at those people who voted no, there is a number of them who are either practicing in a particular faith or grew up practicing in a particular faith. And whilst that's not a hard and fast rule, there were some who I'm not aware of them having any faith at all who voted against it for practical concerns. There did seem to be some correlation in relation to faith, and it was prominently discussed, actually, in a way that I don't think, from memory of watching the House of Commons debate, it came up too often.
So I think one of the reasons it didn't come up so much in the House of Commons debate was that in the week leading up to it, there'd been some really bad examples of how to not talk about faith. So Lord Faulkner had come out and said Shabana Mahmood was only voting against it to impose her Muslim beliefs on everyone, which was completely not the case. So I think it's probably understandable by the time that Friday rolled around, the media had done so much talking about or over-hyping, I guess, the role of faith in the debate that it didn't come through as much.
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because the Senate debate on the topic happened a couple of weeks before the, I want to say 29th of November, second reading of Kim Ledbetter's bill. And it was also on a much broader motion, which I do think probably would have made one or two people vote against it in a way that I don't know if it had been on a similar motion as to the Ledbetter bill, we may have got a different result, but we just don't know. So Ben, we discussed it a little bit in that question, but the dry laws, there's a huge monumental thing that happened to Wales, and it talks so much to the interconnectivity between faith and our politics in Cymru. So what can you tell us about them?
Dissertations have been written on this, so I'm going to try and condense this as much as possible. But Sunday closing in Wales was the first piece of legislation that was Wales only since the Laws in Wales Act 1542. So when Sunday Closing Wales Act 1881 came through, it closed all the pubs on Sundays, everywhere in Wales, except in Monmouthshire. Monmouthshire has a get out because they weren't seen as part of Wales, which I always find slightly fascinating. But really, it fitted with a Welsh culture, that Calvinistic, nonconformist Welsh culture of, as a BBC reporter who was covering the 61 referenda said that, we compose hymns and poems and we're sad. It really did embrace that sort of liberal ordering of society. And I think as it grew, like it was continued and augmented through the First World War, and then again in 1921 when the poor people of Monmouthshire fell under the under the remit of the Act, because that was when they were seen as part of Wales and not separate. It was a different Wales. It was such a different Wales. And looking at BBC clips of it, it just seems like it could be a century ago, not 50 years ago, 150 years, 200 years ago. There was a great quote, and I won't give you the whole thing, where they interviewed a gentleman who worked down a coal mine, and he'd found the new faith, socialism. And one of the things that had put him off, these weren't his words, this is my kind of summarization, was the two-facedness and the hand in glove between the nonconformist chapels and the masters, so that the man who'd come and measure their output, who wasn't very generous, he added, would be carrying the measuring book, would be the same man carrying the Bible on a Sunday. I think, you'd need a drink after chapel to put up with that. But of course, it was a juxtaposition. It was all smoke and mirrors, because private social clubs, if they had a booze license, could serve on Sundays if their committees allowed it. So the only people really being affected were publicans and visitors who hadn't gone to an offie. So when you get to 1961, you get, it's no surprise, it's the North and the West that vote to stay dry. Industrial South and East want the pubs open. And in a way, you see you see the linguistic and the cultural, and also the kind of the rural, the modern juxtaposition in Wales. But one of the major surprises is the Church of Wales came out in favour of Sunday opening. Edwin Morris, who's Archbishop at the time and Bishop of Monmouth, no stranger to controversy, wrote a pamphlet called The Christian Use of Alcoholic Beverages, which he asked to had printed in Visca and then asked to be read in churches the week before the vote. Again, there's a great BBC clip of them interviewing a vicar saying that, how can the nonconformists be so puritanical? It's like, Cromwell's Commonwealth. How can they not see that this is good for them? What I found really kind of digging around this interesting was that Plaid had a massive issue. This was kind of a major stumbling block for Plaid, of course. And they couldn't make an official policy. And this went back to 1953 to the annual conference. So they had to kind of work as individuals. So particularly, Gwynfor Evans, who was very, very anti-Sunday opening and campaigned against it both in 61 and in 68. By 68, the votes had narrowed considerably. Where had been absolutely rock solid 10 years before, it had dropped 8-9 points everywhere. So Pembrokeshire, which had thoroughly stayed dry in 61, went wet in 68. But you still had that seam of Carmarthen, Ceredigion, up to Gwynedd and to Ynys Môn, all dry. And slowly through the 70s and 80s, that became more weakened as the nonconformist Calvinism faltered and failed. I think there's something of nonconformity and the death of nonconformity and this, but that'll be something for post-doc, I think.
There was a brilliant story a couple of weeks ago about one of the Scottish islands where they finally got a Sunday opening supermarket for the first time. And I was struck by two things about that. One, there was a group of, I assume, Christians that were campaigning against it. And with no disrespect, the pictures that could have been something out of the 60s or 70s kind of transplanted in when you saw even just the stuff they were wearing. But also how quickly people had got used to it. There was a fantastic quote from a guy that was like, I never intended to be the first person to buy anything here on a Sunday, but I need to bag potatoes, so here I am. And that sense that even a week before, like, you would have just carried on life without the bag of potatoes, but as soon as he was over, then obviously he did, and life moved on. Yeah.
Capitalism and commercialism moving in as pragmatism. On that kind of Scottish note, it's either the Free Church of Scotland or one of the very small fringe groups of it. Forgive me for not knowing directly. They close their website on a Sunday because it is the Lord's Day. And they tell people who go on it, like, thank you for visiting our website, but it's the Lord's Day, today. Go to church. go worship God.
You know, I'm going to spend next Sunday trying to find which denomination that is.
Yeah, yeah. I think it might have been the Free Church of Scotland, colloquially known as the Wee Frees. Apologies to any of them if they're listening, for saying that, but that's what they're known as. I do wonder whether, if the World Wide Web had existed in 1950s Wales, whether Presbyterian Church in Wales, as it is now, would have taken a similar view. It's, it's not, the links are there, but obviously the technology wasn't. So what's the thought there?
I've got one last question for you both before we wrap up, and it's about tolerance and forgiveness. So it's two key Christian values, but do you think they still have a role in our politics and in our society as it all around us starts to feel a bit more polarized?
I'm mindful of recent coverage of the Anglican churches, especially in England, in saying this. So I'll kick off by stating that. I think we do need better tolerance, a greater level of what I would call Christian charity in wider society. Living in a 24-hour age where you have non-stop media, non-stop commentary, Twitter, now known as X, Instagram, all those things, where people are sitting there waiting for you to make a mistake. Inevitably, we're human, and that's going to happen. And I think really what we need to do is slow down, take a step back, and acknowledge that we are frail and that we often misstep, and that we may not choose our words or our actions right. There should always be consequences, but I'm not saying we should always have forgiveness as a wipe clean. But I do think that we need to maybe be slightly mindful that we are human, and that in a 24-hour news cycle is going to be evident, because you can't be perfect and you can't curate yourself continually.
Anna?
Yeah, I think to pick up the point on forgiveness, we definitely do need it, and it is definitely something that still has a place in public life, but only if it's properly understood. So I think it was during the Partygate scandal, Michael Gove came out and said several times that actually, yes, Boris Johnson had done stuff wrong, but we needed good Christian forgiveness towards our leaders. Now, my understanding of that was that he was sort of saying is that get off the hook kind of thing, which is not what forgiveness, or not what kind of the Christian understanding of that is. It is about wiping the slate clean, but it's not free. It's costly to go kind of very preachery, I guess, but it comes with a cost. It comes with consequences, and it comes with a recognition of having done something wrong. And I think those things have to go hand in hand. I think certainly over the last few years, in politics, we've seen politicians who are very slow to recognise when they've got something wrong, which actually makes it harder, or can make it harder to forgive. So we should be quick to forgive, but at the same time, it would be good if we were quicker to recognise all of our need actually for forgiveness, to end on a very heavy theological note there.
Well, thank you both so much for coming to speak to us this evening. If people want to hear more from you, where can they go find you on social media? Ben?
You can find me on X, formerly Twitter, at Liturgical Ben.
Wonderful. Hannah?
I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hannah M.E. Rich.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you'd like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod. This is Matt Hexter, just signing off all our wonderful Hiraeth listeners for the year with a reading that is, I think, a nice fitting send-off, binding both politics and religion at this Christmas time. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Nadolig Llawen. Merry Christmas all.